Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, everybody. Welcome to Maternal and Infant Health Canada's educational webinar series. Today, we are joined by Norma Swenson, who is discussing assessing the impact of global women's health movement and interdisciplinary and personal reflection. As with all of our public webinars, I have to always add the following disclaimer. This course and handouts may contain general information about medical conditions and treatments. The information is not advice and should not be treated as such. As usual, I am your moderator, Dr. Emily Solomons. I am a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine and a MIHCAN cluster lead. I'm zooming in from the ancestral territories of the unceded lands of the Coast Salish people. I'm also in what's known as New Westminster, BC. We also have Dr. Farah Shroff, who is the founder and lead of Maternal and Infant Health Canada, as well as a former Takemi Fellow at Harvard University who has joined us. So thank you so much. Our distinguished speaker today, who we're so absolutely fortunate to have, has a master's in public health and is one of the leaders of the global women's health movement. She is an alumna of and former professor at the Harvard School of Public Health and co-founder, co-author of the international best-selling banned book in some places, Our Bodies, Ourselves, smuggled and stolen across the globe. So we are so incredibly fortunate to have Norma Swenson here speaking with us. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic onto her and she can present assessing the impact of global women's health movement and interdisciplinary and personal reflection. So thank you so much.
Well, folks, after that, I'm looking around to see who this person is because when I hear descriptions of myself, I say, that's ridiculous. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that I have gone so far and had so much influence in a realm where so-called lay people are not supposed to even be, let alone have anything to say. And I think if we are to pick maybe one thing out of all of the things about our bodies, ourselves, and what's happened to it, maybe that's the one we should pick, because not one of us had any kind of medical training or nursing training. I think one person had a social work background maybe, but that's it. We were not published authors. What a terrible thing that you produce a bestseller and you've never written anything before. All these things attach to our history and they look like quirky details, but actually they are saying something very important, which is that women have a right to know, they have a right to learn, they have a right to see what used to be secret documents and papers, and they have a right to speak about it. And the silence that women displayed on this subject was one of the things that fascinated me from the very beginning. The first thing really that I want to do today before I say much more about me is to say how much I appreciate Canada. Now, those of you who are living and working in Canada, you have plenty of stories about all the problems and difficulties and so forth, but believe me, compared to what we go through on a regular basis, it's really nothing. But that's not my point. And my point is that, how shall I say, you have always been there. And for me, the fact that when I got into this movement, Canada was one of the first. And it was a childbirth education association. So when in my imagination, when I think of community organizing or childbirth education groups, I think of Canada. Also, as I've been part of Michael Klein's group on maternity care discussion, the quality of attention to clinical skills, the onrush of modern technologies that complicate and sometimes help medical and nursing care, there's really nothing else like it. And Americans still are learning to think with a critical eye or ear on a lot of things that come down the line. So thank you, Canada. But it's more than that. When Sheila Kitzinger's book first appeared, now Sheila Kitzinger may no longer be a name that's familiar to all of you, but generations of women were reading Sheila Kitzinger, and she kept producing books for them to read. But her first book was The Experience of Childbirth, and published in 1968. But the book was only available in Canada because it was originally published in England, and we couldn't get it. So one of the first underground activities that we undertook was to send people from Vermont up to the Canadian border, where groups of women had bought large numbers of the books, and we paid for them in American dollars and took them away and sold them here because we couldn't get the book any other way. So that's another little connection to Canada. But I think the most important one really is there was some work done on adoption reform that I thought was exceptional, and I think a lot of Americans also thought so. And then the amazing story of how you got your right to an abortion in Canada when it was illegal there, not in quite the same way it was here, but it was still illegal for a long time. But the other one, of course, is MIHCAN. And I don't know how many people here ever knew Murray or went to Murray's website or understood what he was trying to do in Canada, but his work in Toronto on establishing midwifery and his work with Ian Chalmers and the perinatal database, Cochrane in England, was exceptional. And he was my first living OB mentor. And he remained such really all through the years of my career. I never really lost touch with him, even though it's not visible from the outside. And he's a gem and a pioneer, and Michael, of course, knows all that. So Canada has a special place in my heart. Judy Norsegian, who spoke to you some weeks ago, apparently, she and I took a marvelous trip through the Canadian Rockies one fall. I forget what we were doing there. I think we'd been invited to speak, but I will never forget that. That was a lifetime experience. So Canada's in my heart. But what I was thinking I would do this morning, which I wasn't going to do, and I'm skipping a lot here about Murray and my work with WHO with remember now, it's written here, Marsden Wagner. I don't know how many of you knew Marty Wagner, probably not. He's been dead a while now, but he did write one of the best books actually on what was wrong with the maternity care system and what we might do about it. And I worked with him and other people in WHO Euro for quite a while. So I got to travel this way, but I'm ahead of the story, and I'm going to ask my timekeepers here, Tommy and Patricia, if they will stop me if I get too close to the halfway mark. But I think I want to tell the story of my birth. I don't always do this, but it's been so long ago now that I think it will be valuable, especially if we don't get around to some of the video clips that I have ordered. So here we are, it's 1949, and I'm living in Boston. I'm about to graduate from high school. And there was a magazine that was in everybody's house. It was called the Reader's Digest. And what it meant was that people were too busy to read the whole thing. So Reader's Digest would condense it for you. In the back of that, each month, I guess, was the condensation of a book. And as I was graduating from high school, that book was Grantley Dick Reed's Childbirth Without Fear. And I read the whole thing and I said, of course, if I ever have a baby, that's what I'm going to do. So the stage in a way was set by the fact that the movement was already here. At that time, I knew nothing about what was going on at Yale, and I'm not going to be able to talk about it today, but I was in on the brink. So let's move ahead to giving birth in the best hospital in New England in the 1950s. And I had not enough money for a private OB, so I was a clinic patient. And that actually made it possible for me to have an extraordinary experience, because clinic patients were not in those days managed by anybody except OBGYN residents. So I had this bunch of young guys, and when they found out what I wanted to do, they thought it would be fun to see what happened to me. And so when I refused everything that they were offering me, they let me keep going. Now, that fluke has really been the foundation of everything I've ever done since, because what it allowed me to do and what horrified me so much was seeing what was happening to other women. This was the era of twilight sleep, and what women were getting was scopolamine and Demerol. Now, scopolamine probably is a funny word at this point that people have no idea was ever used in birth. It's a hallucinogen. It's a cerebral sedative. And when I heard that this is what they wanted to give me in the preparatory time, I remember going down the hall and calling up the medical library and saying, what is scopolamine? And that's when I found out it was a cerebral sedative. And I said to myself, this most important experience of my life, and I'm going to knock my brain out? Are you serious? So they let me do it. And if it hadn't been for one doctor, because I remember I was starting to get uncomfortable, and I said, I don't know, is this really how it's supposed to be? And I said, if you gave me something now, what would happen? And he said, listen, you're almost fully, I didn't understand what that meant, but you're almost fully. In a few minutes, it'll be gone. And it was true. And I had the kind of exhilarating birth that people talk about, but you always wonder if they're really serious. And I really had a marvelous birth. However, because I was awake before that happened, I saw other women under the influence of scopolamine. And at that time, there was a movie going around called The Snake Pit that was showing what happened to women who were in mental hospitals. And one of the things that they did to them was tie them up in their beds. They had canvas ties that were pulled up and put over them so they could not get out of bed. And those canvas ties had been borrowed by the OB department in this fancy hospital to tie women into their beds. So here they were, screaming. They were calling for their husbands. Some of them were cursing their husbands. They were calling for their mothers. They were in anguish because they had no tools to manage their discomfort. They just had all they had was a little Demerol. And it was a scene from Bedlam. And I looked around in this room with these 9 women, or whatever it was, And I thought, this cannot be happening. This cannot be real, that they would do this to women, or, and of course they explained it was to keep them from falling out of bed. But, and then afterwards to see them come out of it and be their original selves, smiling and talking and so forth. But there were doctors in this country at that time who already had seen enough of twilight sleep, and they felt that women deserved better, and they wanted to do something about it. But I didn't find them right away. And so when I finally got involved with this group, I realized that I was in a class by myself, because most of the people who had formed the groups around Canada and around the United States had heard Grantley Dick read when he came here and talked about his book. And he had numbers in his back pocket that he never showed to the doctors. He just kept talking to the women. And it was the wives of the doctors who wanted to start these CEA groups, Childbirth Education Association. So that was my introduction. And the women in the group, most of them had not had anything resembling a natural birth. So they were still in pain and in trauma for the kind of birth they had, and they wanted to try to prevent other women from having it if they could. So that's how I got started. And in a way, it defined me, and it defined what I did thereafter, because I did not think there was anything that exceptional about me. And I thought to myself, if I can do this, any woman can do it. But it's amazing how a culture can produce a myth. And we had myths that childbirth was so painful, so dangerous, so life-threatening to the baby, that no woman would refuse anything that was offered to her. It was a hideous choice that she had to make. So that's how I got my start. And in a way, I would like to show you what other women were experiencing at that time. And I don't know, we're all out of sequence now, aren't we, Patricia, to show the beginning of the childbirth film. I think I'm not going to show you today, but I invite you to look, because they've done a terrific job of taking the original film called Hospital Maternity Care Family Centered, that was made in Evansville, Indiana in about 1968, when they instituted family-centered maternity care there. And it is filled with instructive exchanges and scenes of the mothers in postpartum sitting around smoking, drinking coffee in the hospital. I mean, it's a treat. I invite you to look, but I think I'm not going to show that today. But what I could show you is a little clip from the 50th anniversary of BASE, which was in 2003, the Boston Association for Childbirth Education. As you may remember, I went from being president of BASE to president of the International, and that's how the international connections began. What do you think, Tommy? Can we show those clips now? Is this a possibility? Would say, let's skip the first two. I'm sorry to do that, wonderful old black and white, but I just want everybody to go and find it. It's now a production of the Seattle group. Seattle was one of the first CEAs in the country, and they helped to arrange that film.
My first question when I came into BASE is the same question I have today. Why do women have so little to say about what happens to them?
20 patients were all lined up in a row in this big labor room, all flat on their backs, and they're all given routine injections of scopolamine and apomorphine. And then they went into the delivery room and had a spinal for the birth. Later on, waking up in the recovery room, Some were very happy, said, oh, I didn't feel a thing, it was wonderful. Others said, I missed out on something. This can't be the right thing.
My husband wanted to be with me when we had when we had them all, but it began when we had the first few, of course, and he was not allowed in. He was given my clothes in a paper bag and told they would call him.
I tried to get somebody to cooperate with me and do this with me, and he was one of the big Boston doctors, and he said he would cooperate, but he didn't. And as soon as he had a chance, he knocked me out completely, and I had one the old way.
I kind of thought I'd signed up for natural childbirth. Well, big surprise, no. I was just tied into the bed like everybody else, and got something, I'm not sure what, and I did say something afterwards, and he said, well, I only gave you 1/10 as many drugs as I usually give to people. And I said, well, how come the baby was born at 10:30 in the morning and I didn't wake up until 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Oh, well, he didn't bother to answer patients. Who cares what a mother wants?
I had a monitrice, and she came into the hospital with me. I might not have had her as somebody else come, you know, I don't know, Justine, whether she was coming into hospital to coach. But that was key. This woman was going to keep that doctor's hands off of me.
So when I was having my first baby, first of all, I had to find a doctor, and I had to go back to the line and have a doctor there for the lack of anything better that I could find. But I asked my friend, Abigail Avery, if she could come with me. Abigail was 8 years older than I and had been to the Yale School of Nursing also, but she also had been to maternity center. When I read Dr. Grantley DeGreet's book, I realized that he had the answer that I was looking for. He believed that childbirth was a natural, normal process of the human body, and for a woman, it should be a normal, happy experience. But now I had Grantley DeGreet's principal statement in my head and found they worked with me, and so I thought I would help other people. Then I met Jean Whiffen, who is a physical therapist who came from England with her husband to study here. Her husband came to study, and she had worked with Helen Herdman, who had worked with Dr. Reed. And so she was teaching classes to patients of Dr. Galt, who was at the Lyman Hospital. I met her and went to one of her classes. Then, Abby said to me, I saw in the paper that there's a group of women who want to get together and form a childbirth group, education group, such as they have in Seattle and Milwaukee. And here's the, I can't go, she said, but here's the notice. So I went, and there I met a group who had mostly been going to Mrs. Whiffen's classes. And so they said, okay, we'll get going right away. So they set up the group right away with president, vice president, chairman, and all the rest of it. And they said, well, we need a teacher, so why don't you?
And I called Maternity Center in New York. And I said, how do I get natural childbirth in Boston? They referred me to Justine. So I went to Justine, I went to her class, and I said, of course it's for me, there's no question.
For my classes, I only had the husbands come to the last class because I figured at that time, they didn't need to, they owned everything. I didn't realize the importance at that time, but we soon got the husbands more involved and tried to get them to go to the hospital and be allowed in the hospital. It was a very gradual thing. People, if they had a good experience, they'd tell us, and then we recommended these doctors to other people. And then we tried to train the husbands so that they could go with their wives to stand up for them.
I learned about this group that were getting together about natural childbirth, and I joined in. That would be about 1951 to 2, and just started visiting them, going with a friend, and hearing what they had to say. I wasn't the terribly active type in teaching or taking classes or anything, but they got me to be secretary.
After that, I did begin to meet the other base people. Justine introduced me to some other people, and we began to have meetings around dining room tables. We began to hold public meetings. We began having local meetings, such as libraries, other places where people could learn about this. If they didn't want natural childbirth, they could learn about childbirth, which they didn't know. And a number of people did realize they would like to be part of this.
So the first meeting I ever went to meet the women in base, the meeting was being held at a classroom in Boston University, and two things were happening. Number one, on the floor, no less, being scuffed around by us as we got into our seats, were newsletters from the International Childbirth Education Association. I didn't even know there was an international group. And the fact that we were not alone, the fact that what was happening here in base in Boston was being mirrored by groups all across the country was terribly exciting to me.
The night that I went into labor, I was at a base meeting on rooming in. I had never heard of rooming in until that night. All of a sudden, I'm standing there talking to Mary, and I felt this incredible contraction. And I guess that, I didn't know for sure, but, it seemed like it was labor. And I had Nikki the next day, and then she did get to room in with me. So I have this incredible sense of how just by, the turn of fate, I had the kind of experience I had.
So the 60s and 70s, I was working in childbirth as a labor support, as teaching other couples, and going to doctors' offices, confronting them, saying I was looking for a place to refer couples in the class. And they would talk about fanatics, and they would talk about masochists, they would talk about just a fluke that it goes well, how dangerous childbirth is.
At that same time, there was a push on, of course, to get fathers into delivery at City Hospital. That took quite a while, but it did go through. The East Boston fathers were particularly involved in going into delivery and began bombarding the hospital and insisting on appointments with the chief of obstetrics and gynecology. And it was really great to see them become empowered to seek this out themselves. Later on, we had a program in conjunction with the Black United Front where we kind of besieged the hospital, I guess. 3 weeks after we started the program there, the hospital declared itself family-centered, and 6 months later, they admitted fathers.
But we didn't have a real vehicle to make a public splash. And we didn't know we were going to make a public splash. I simply invited Dr. Robert Bradley, who was then the author of the book called Husband Coach Childbirth, that had a film that was made in Calgary, Canada, if I recall, black and white, wonderful film of a natural birth with a woman very much awake and talking and the husband present. And the room was packed, and there were people lining the walls and filling the corridors, and the museum officials were deeply alarmed and distressed. They had no idea what was happening or why this was happening. And I don't know if they tried to stop the meeting, but they were very concerned, and we promised to be good. And it was one of the things that put base on the map.
Because I delivered in May, and in September I called base. And I called and said, I'd like to volunteer, I'd like to help out in whatever way I can. I didn't know very much about the organization at the time, and they said, well, we're having the first class for instructors. Are you interested? I thought, yeah, I'm interested. So I actually signed up for the first class that they gave and joined that class. And when I finished, I took over Mary's position because she was leaving Cambridge to go back to school. So I started teaching, and ultimately in the early 70s, I was teaching anywhere from 3 to 4 classes a week because the demand was so intense.
And what we really were doing was raising consciousness, letting people know in the area, maybe who had never even thought of having their husbands in the birth with them, or who had never even thought that you could have a baby without a spinal. We were just letting them know that this is a perfectly reasonable thing for somebody to be interested in, and that it's a possibility.
I see that as one of the roles of BASE, is making women empowered to know that that is possible, and teaching them to stand up on their hind legs and demand it when it isn't given to them. One of the major effects of teaching BASE classes in a community setting, as opposed to in a hospital setting, always was that you would have couples from different OBs, different group practices, different hospitals. And without the instructor having to do anything at all, the couples would speak during the break in class and compare notes about what their doctor told them was normal and what the other doctor told them was normal. And it happened very frequently that as a result of the classes, and not with me pushing them, but with me giving them permission to change doctors, and or to tell their doctor that they heard this doctor would do such and such, wouldn't you do that too? And that was very, very productive for change.
I think we probably should stop this because we're chewing up quite a bit of time, but I hope you enjoyed that portrait of how things were in the early days of a movement that has pretty well died out. Maternity Center Association in New York was one of the people, one of the agencies that made a huge difference in those years, because they were training people to give community classes. And this is all part of the spirit of the original Yale project, which I'm not talking about today, but to say that that influence persisted. And some of you know the work of Carol Sakala, who became one of the leaders of the Maternity Center Association. And it's the work that she is doing is still going on under the program of the National Center for Families. I can't say it all, but you know what it is probably. Anyway, that's a glimpse of the picture, but that movement was literally untouched by what came next. And I don't believe that feminism itself could have persisted without the opening up of all of these issues. And in a way, the women's health movement became a kind of bridge on which childbirth innovation and protest was going on. If that hadn't existed, there was a whole wing there. But what our bodies ourselves did, which had not been done before by anybody, was put the whole thing under one set of covers. We were going to talk about sexuality. We were going to talk about abortion. We were going to talk about birth control, and we were going to talk about childbirth. Nobody had ever done that before, not even in popular books. So it became the beginning of trying to stitch women back together again, who had been chopped up and separated into these medical specialties that sometimes didn't even communicate with one another, and try to also put an end to the tragedy, as I'm going to call it a tragedy, of abandoning families in the postpartum period. There was no official or systematic or medical supervision or intervention. If you were poor enough, you might have a visiting nurse come, but if you were not poor enough, you were strictly on your own. And that's where the breastfeeding support groups that existed in that period were so crucial to everyone's survival. Without them, women would have had nothing. And even today, we don't have a system that sees this as a childbearing year. Midwives see it, they teach it, they live it, but the medical profession has never addressed that gap. And that's one of the things we have to think about. What I am going to do now is ask for a time check and see what we can salvage from the rest.
So we've got about probably about 10-15 more of kind of lecture time, and then we'll do a few questions.
Okay, so I haven't come really, have I, to the women's health movement. And I'm now going to stop this reading and I'm just going to wing it from there because I want to be sure that I get the highlights. But I want to go back one step to the birth scene because there are people particularly interested. One of my first living OB mentor was Marie Enkin, and my first living midwife mentor was Kitty Ernst. And some of you may have known Kitty Ernst, and if you didn't, and if they're not making a film about her, maybe we should make a film about her because she was a lioness. She was absolutely fearless and determined that birth centers were going to emerge as the alternative. And I do believe they will, but I don't think I'm going to live to see it because hospitals have become such dangerous places, such expensive places. I don't know how your nosocomial infection rates in Canada are going right now, but they are so bad in Boston, in the best places at this moment, that I met with a group of midwives and childbirth educators just the other day, and they said they're no longer recommending hospital birth unless you have some serious condition. That is a huge statement because they were all in to prepare people to try to get the best and avoid the worst of the hospital situation. But because, folks, and this was way, way back 20 years ago, pediatricians were already raising questions about, here you've got this beautiful, healthy newborn baby, and you're putting it in this environment where 2/3 of the energy is spent fighting the infections that are all around in the nursery and on the doorknobs, everywhere. What are we thinking? Are we thinking that this is good for the baby? We can't be serious. It took them a long time to kill the central nursery, but they did it. The earlier clips I was going to show you from the black and white film talk a lot about how breaking down the central nursery was an important part of the success of a family-centered program, but I'm drifting. One of the things that Kitty and I talked about, one of the last conversations, in fact, I ever had with her before she died, was about fentanyl, because the people you heard tonight in the film were not the ones given fentanyl, but some people were. And when she found out this was becoming an option drug and a street drug, she was horrified. She said, we gave up on fentanyl years ago because it was so dangerous, and now it's back. So how can we support hospital birth? And yet, what options do women have without it? And what preparation do they have for negotiating this? We now in the doula phase, 100%, they're part of the team. Is that enough? I leave you with that question, but I wanted to remind you where we've come from. And I didn't talk at all about forceps. The decision of whether or not to use forceps was on the table every single time, because the surgical model assumes that the baby is this inert mass that has to be removed somehow. And if you don't remove it with suction, that came later, but in the early days, there was still the forceps decision. And there was an atmosphere post-World War II that any young woman coming of age had a dream, and the only dream she had was getting married and having 3 children. That was it. If you were a serious, normal woman, this is what you dreamed about. And of course, that meant babies. But never forget that the hospitalization of birth was an accident. It was not planned. It was not scientific. The place of birth is something that was only addressed in England, maybe by Sheila and some of her colleagues at the National Childbirth Trust, as an important element that people ought to consider when they evaluate birth situations. And Um, I'll never forget, I made a return trip to the Boston Lying-in Hospital where I had given birth. And we discovered, Jane Pincus, who's listening, will remember this discovery, that the architects who created that hospital and hospitals like it were using industrial manufacturing as their model. So you had the labor on one floor, and then when you got to a certain stage, you moved to the second floor, and then to the surgical suite, and then to recovery and postpartum. I mean, it was all like a factory. It was a beautiful building, and they had a pavilion, which was the style for upper class women in those days, but it was a factory. And the workers were trained to think like factory workers. And in the clip that I didn't show you, Sister Mary Stella, who is one of my role models, explains how she got in touch with herself as a factory manager in the system that she was in, and what her transformation was like when she came into family-centered maternity care. But even that, you will find an incredible joke, but they're very serious, and it's instructive. So the women's health movement, in that sense, as I said, couldn't have existed without feminism, I don't believe, or persisted, maybe that's the right word, because it was finally about the body. Now, feminism was intended to be a challenge to every single male-dominated institution in our culture, whether it was law, medicine, or anything else, including education. And what feminism said to women was, you have to have something to say about this, and particularly something to say about your body. So one of the first things that I did was make a contribution with George Annis, who has now become a very distinguished emeritus law professor at BU, to raise the question of informed consent in the maternity care environment. It didn't exist. People were done to, and there was no conversation. There was no, do you want this? Do you not want this? And he helped me blow the whistle on that part of the system. But what the women's health movement did was say, we have a right to this information. We have a right to challenge it, and we have the right to say no. Now, we're not there yet, folks, and not in any hospital environment. And the hospital can always say, well, in this place, we're responsible for a lot of other people besides you. And I knew the lawyer at the Harvard School of Public Health who really put this dictum in place all across the country, that hospitals could always hide behind that. Well, that's another reason not to give up your autonomy on the doormat, but to say, we need a different place where our needs and our feelings and our health and our safety are all taken into consideration together. And it's to the credit of Ruth Lubick and Kitty Ernst that out of the Maternity Center Association came this movement for birthing centers, which I still think is the future. I also think it's the future, and I know I'm digressing from the main theme, but I want everyone to have a sense. Let me go back a bit and just show you what I was going to give you first as the news from Our Bodies, Ourselves. And one of the wonderful items on that list, and this may be too hard for you to switch gears right now, Patricia, but the first one was, first of all, to talk about Judy and say she's stepping down as the chair of Our Bodies, Ourselves. And this is after almost 50 years of wearing one hat or another hat, but keeping the reins in her hand in a beautiful way. And we have a new chair, and her name is Diana Numumbiaja. And if we can have that picture, and maybe we can't, I would love to show her to you because she is a very beautiful lady, and has leadership imagination, which we need very much. And then the next one is a book that I think just came out on June 20th or something like that, called Safe in a Midwife's Hands: Birthing Traditions from Africa and the American South. And that is by my old friend, Linda Janet Holmes. Among the other contributions that she has made, by the way, is to show that even under the most desperate conditions, the traditional granny midwives of the South had better outcomes than they are having today in the hospitals in the South. Not just in the South. Let's stick to Alabama. That's where the data are. And you can see that in some of her other writings, including Listen to Me Good, which was her first book on the subject. And then my school, Harvard School of Public Health, now Harvard-CHAN, last fall did a major report on racism and its effects on health, and essentially put down the gauntlet and saying, this has to come first. We have to do this now. We have to be done with excuses, because if we're serious about the health of the population of this country, we can't keep putting people of color in some category where, when they deserve the best of care, they're getting the least of care, and many other related issues. So that the cover of that is an amazing thing, and I think Patrice is going to help us see that in just a minute. So those were going to be the news items, except that, and I sent a picture to you very early of me and Raquel Pereira, who is our coordinator for the Brazilian edition. But finally, as her husband put it, we have a cesarean book that was desperately snatched out of the failing publishing system in Brazil to become the first Our Bodies, Ourselves in Brazilian Portuguese, Nossos Corpos. And that what's to become of it, no one knows, but it exists and it's going to make a difference. And I hope at some point it will make a difference in North America, because I know you have a lot of Brazilians in Canada and we have them here. And I think to have a North American edition would be very exciting to help people see the differences between the Canadian system and the American system in a way that we don't do. I mean, you're sitting up there and we never acknowledge your existence. It's quite ridiculous, but anyway.
We're the quiet younger sibling. On that note, there was a question that came up that I'd love to kind of transition into our question period, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So it's very much on what you were just talking about. So we appear to be taking many steps backwards in our progress towards supporting physiological birth. This is especially relevant in the southern states of the US, but it is globally. So what have you learned in that first wave of the movement that would help the younger generation in this next wave of birth advocacy and activism? It's a loaded question. I know it's
it's
not an easy one to answer.
You know, when I write another dissertation, I will, but no, seriously, there's a lot that can be done. And in a way, what is happening is that the doula, the necessity for the doula or for a doula is paving the way for more systematic labor support, not just for the laboring woman, but for the family as a group. and paving the way for what it would be like if we had a network of birthing centers where no cesareans could possibly happen. And that's a double-edged sword. One of the reasons for the cesarean epidemic, I think, is because that was the last trump card that they could play, the surgically trained people, that they could do the cesarean, but family docs could not, midwives could not. But I think the necessity of continuous support, I think, let's see, the second director of the Maternity Center Association in New York, who was a wonderful dear woman who's long gone, and whether or not I remember her name, I remember that her dissertation was about continuous support during labor and delivery. I don't know of any system that offers that without a doula. It's not possible because of the way the nursing staff is deployed. So if we can establish that as a right, as a not a fringe part of the package, but a central part of the package, then I think we have a chance to say, if an institution or a setting cannot provide this for you, they're in violation, or don't go there, or whatever it is. We're not there yet, but we could get there. And that's one of the ways we could get there, because otherwise, the most terrible study I ever heard of was when they had let the genie out of the bottle and natural childbirth was a word on people's lips. And Yale decided that they were going to kill that once and for all. And they were going to study what happened to women when they were totally abandoned in labor. And it was a travesty. I don't know if the movies are still out there, but it was a travesty. That kind of abandonment should be illegal. Or parents should think, whatever happens, even if I don't have a husband, or even if my mother died, or whatever, I am entitled to somebody knowledgeable and supportive to be with me all the time. I don't know. That's the best answer I can give.
Oh, I thank you so much, Norma. It is really such an honor to have you with us today. And I wanted to just ask you one more question. And I just wanted to also ask everybody who's joined us today if they could please fill in the questionnaire, which is an evaluation questionnaire. We've put the links in the chat. And Norma, if you could please just give us some reflections on the topics that you're talking about, which are historical and yet very, very present. Like, we work a lot in India. There are some hospitals in India, particularly private ones, which have a 100% C-section rate today. And so we're seeing these movements all around the world going backwards, right? So we here in Canada have worked very, very hard to humanize childbirth and to reduce our C-section rates, and yet countries all around the world are moving in the opposite direction. And so it seems like this is a time when the US does need to work in solidarity with feminist health movements around the world to get everything from Roe v. Wade back and those kinds of things that are happening in the US. What thoughts do you have? Because Boston Women's Health Collective has been at the forefront of global organizing for women's health. How do you feel like the global women's health movement can come together at a time like today?
I think that's a mixed answer I'm going to give you, because all of the countries at a certain level, and of course they are arranged in tiers, and it depends on how the economists evaluate them, what tier your country ends up in. But there are 2 or 3 problems. I want to see if I can say them really fast. One of them is that most governments have put the provision of health and medical care services as an economic problem. And that means that skimping and trying to save money and all of that is high on their list. The other problem is that there's always this fear that, and some of it is quite justified, that technologies and medicines and practices that have come from the West are really not useful. And not only are they not useful, but often they can be quite destructive. I've been watching the situation in East Africa for a while, and I see that the introduction of private equity and private capital is decimating the medical system there in a way. It used to be a role model, and people still come from all over to go to Nairobi, but they're making a huge mistake. So I don't know a quick answer except to say that it helps if people who are trained in decision making understand that it's community groups are not a nuisance only. Sometimes they are a nuisance, but they are an essential part of making sure that the community is engaged, because people will vote with their feet. If it gets too bad, they'll say, we're not going to the hospital. And I think some of that is happening here in Massachusetts. One of the pieces that Judy recently circulated for all of us was the horrendous numbers. Here, Massachusetts is one of the richest states in the United States. And we have mortality in communities of color that is unexplainable almost, except that, yes, that's what you would expect in a place so rich in resources for wealthy people, but no, haven't figured out any way to take care of the people who in fact are taking care of them. I mean, that population, for the most part, knows that there's money to be made in supporting wealthy families. So I don't have a quick answer, but I think I would also say, let me say, if I didn't say before, that the hospital system is going to be squeezed out because private equity is also taking over hospitals in the United States. And what they're doing is jettisoning those programs that are really not money makers. And people have known for decades that maternity care is not a big money maker. I mean, it is some, but not a big one. What it is a kind of portal that the family will return to if they have a good experience there. But in that sense, it's part of the public relations department. Well, that is going to come to an end. And when it does, and it's already coming to an end, the infection rates, the difficult experiences that people are having there are going to drive them right straight out. So unfortunately, we don't have a weapon, but what we do have is continue what we're doing. And I would say the same for the global system. There are places, there are people who know how to do it right, and we should watch them and listen to them best we can.
Thank you so much, Norma.
Well, this is not at all what I planned. And what I would offer to anybody listening is if they will, I don't know, write to me, is that the right thing to do to save traffic through your system? I would be happy to send them my draft manuscript of all of the parts and pieces that I was going to say and also show to you. Because we weren't able to do it that way, much of which is my fault.
Oh, no, not at all. You're absolutely welcome to send that to us, and we'll just send it to everybody who joined, and even just our MIHCAN members in general, because we do have them, you know, all over the world, and a lot of them, the time zones don't quite match up, and so
Yes,
they're not always able to tune in live. So yeah, if you share that with us, we'd be happy to share. It's been really informative.
Way, they won't feel maybe that they miss so much, but what can I say? My thinking on all this is a work in progress, as you can see, and I have a lot of stuff on the shelves that I can reach for, but I did think in the end yesterday that telling my birth story really was the right thing to do. I hope you all agree.
Absolutely. I think it's just so important to hear your story and people who have been working in this movement for so long, because it can be this movement is so isolating. I mean, like you said, you didn't know about, our group and all these, we have so many groups around the world. It's the same thing in India. There's so many amazing groups who are doing work, same thing in Mexico, same thing in Nigeria, and all over the world. There are all these little groups of people who are fighting to support physiological birth and to support, the human right and humanizing birth. And we don't always know that the other one exists, and we don't know that we're really not alone in this. And I think just hearing your voice, hearing the work and progress you've made is always so inspiring to the rest of us to know we have to keep on going, and our books will be banned, and we'll keep on going, and we'll be, doors will be shut in our face, and we'll keep on going, because we have each other, and this movement's not small.
I should say that wherever I've gone in the world, and I've been now to some 30 countries, I guess, on a working basis, I always ask if I can go to see the maternity settings, and they are wretched, many of them. Bed springs with no mattresses. I mean, I could go on. The idea of the hospital as a life-giving force is very much alive in the world, and it'll be a while before we're ready to give that up.
Yeah. And Donna had a nice response in our chat. She says, "Rise Up Feminist Archive, good source of historical documents of a movement." So true. Did anybody else want to, you can raise your hand if you want to speak. Oh, here we go. Let's have Dr. Hélène Bertrand. She will, I've just asked you to unmute, so you should be able to speak now.
Norma, I read Our Bodies, Ourselves when it first came out, and it absolutely changed my way of thinking. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. I was a medical student in 1962 at Harvard Medical School, and it was amazing how obstetrics was practiced at the time. And then I moved to and finished at McGill. And when I went for my final exams in obstetrics, I was up for the prize in obstetrics. But I was alone in the room with one of the obstetricians who used to do episiotomies on everybody. They would just cut people up because that was the thing to do. And so I kept saying, well, why? Wait, the hair is coming out. Why are you cutting her? And there would be no answer. Anyway, he got me and he reduced me to tears. And then the other examiners came and said, well, why do you want to get out? You're up for prize. I said, no, I want to get out of here. And this is the way women were treated in those days. And and then I went to South Africa, and I saw how the midwives were delivering babies, how the women could squat to have their babies, how they would allow the head to come out very, very, very slowly and protect the perineum so that the head wasn't going to be hurting the perineum. And I saw the difference between what happened in South Africa and the medical obstetric units, the areas that were the poorest, and what was happening in Boston and in Montreal. And I can tell you that changed my way of seeing childbirth. So thank you, Norma.
How exciting. Oh, I am so happy to hear from you and hear your story. And I wish we could publish it somewhere. Are we running a transcript here today? Does anybody?
It's being recorded, so obviously if it's a Zoom recording.
And the transcripts are not sometimes so reliable, but it does give you a platform for starting. I mean, I would love other people to have your story included in any material that they look at after this is over, because after all, we are not doctors, and medical authority is still one of the most important elements in modern society. So when a physician tells a story like that, it is twice the weight of anything that I might say. So I'm really hoping we can capture your story because it's very instructive.
By the way, Val MIHCAN was a person who gave me preparations for childbirth classes, and she's written books about it as well. So her name is Val MIHCAN, VALMAI.
Okay.
And she wrote a book, I think it's called Birth Story or something.
Yeah.
And she was essential in making sure that I had as normal a childbirth as I could possibly have. And so these are things that need to be said.
Well, and in a strange way, to answer a lot of different questions that were asked today, in a strange way, each new generation of women coming of age has to do some of this work for themselves. That the fact that we have existed and that we have made a tradition out of our bodies ourselves, and it's become in some ways part of mainstream culture for a lot of women, is exactly what we hoped, but it's not enough. And I know right now in California, the section rate is unbelievable. And it is what women want now and expect. In the same way, whoever it was who was talking about 90% in India, the same thing happened in Brazil. There were places in Brazil where there were nothing but sections. That was it. And people felt they were getting inadequate care if they didn't get a section. So we also have to work on popular culture and where these ideas come from. And I do think the obstetrical imagination is, I'm sorry, Michael, but this is what I think, almost the worst model that could ever have been foisted on women. I think I would call it I'll call it a 20th century or 19th, 20th century crime, really. And it was planned. I mean, if you read Neil Devitt's work, he will show you how midwifery was made illegal one state after the other all across the United States. It was done by doctors, and most doctors came from Boston, if you just to make matters worse. But they also had a belief system that they were teaching in medical school, that women's brains were actually inferior because of their hormonal bath that they were in all the time, that they couldn't have a brain adequate to be a physician. So we had generations of, they would let in maybe 4%, maybe 3% women. That was it.
In my class at Harvard Medical School, there were 96 men and 6 women.
That's it. You got it. You were there at the right time. If you'd stayed a couple more years, you would have been there for the revolution that we made by taking over the entire medical campus and having a women's health conference where women came from all of the United States and Canada and Mexico. And we took over everything. It's on our website. If you go there, you can see the booklet that we produced afterwards. But it didn't last, and it couldn't last. And this is where structural factors become so important. If the funding streams continue, if the residency is going to be 4 years and the guy or the woman are going to spend the rest of their lives paying off the debt. I mean, there are so many things built into keeping things the way they are. And we can try to stop the animus, but I don't blame people for feeling like the system is stacked against them, because in fact it is. So if we're going to stop the shame of what is happening in communities of color, even in a state like Massachusetts, we are going to have to get rid of the Medicaid system and say, whatever system we have, it has to be there for everybody. Now, that may slightly increase the numbers of OBGYNs, but what I hope it will do is increase the number of nurse midwives, because without midwives, women are not going to escape from the surgical model.
My daughter had both her children at home with a midwife.
How lovely. Where was that?
That was in Los Angeles.
Yes. No, it is now possible. So what is the impact of the women's health movement? It is to say, we are entitled to our choices. And if you don't give them to us, we will make them. We will produce them ourselves. And that thread runs through everything that's been done, whether it was the Dellums kit for abortion, whether it was underground midwifery, whatever it was, women will find a way.
Absolutely. And that's such a wonderful note to leave this on. And I think you're helping shake off some of the complacency that's been happening over the past couple of decades. I think that the movement is, there's the ebbs and the flows. And I think we're definitely, it's definitely sparking some outrage, which is really needed, so that we can keep pushing forward.
Are beginning to take up. I mean, I think as terrible as the abortion decision was in the United States, and as terrible as Trump has been, they did give us the gift of outrage,
of lighting the fire under
that's right.
our butts. Yes, absolutely. Well, we're at 17 past, so I want to say thank you so much for this, this webinar, this contribution, your decades of contributions. I think that you've really been an inspiration to so many of us in this movement. So it's always amazing to be able to hear you speak and just to connect and to connect with so many people here who are tuning in from multiple continents around the world. And for those of you listening to the recording, also, thank you for tuning in. One last time, I know I've put this a bunch of times in the chat, but we really do want people to fill out the questionnaire. So if you could just go to it, it's really quick, but it really does help us navigate who we bring on and how, what topics we cover. So
I think one of the things I was going to say that I wrote into my draft is my friend Linda Holmes. You must invite Linda. Her history is unique. She presents herself as a writer, and she has done more work on the origins of community midwifery in the United States, particularly in communities of color, than any other person I know. And I think you would be delighted. And she has this new book, which I've seen, but I haven't read. I think you might find her a fascinating guest.
absolutely. I've documented it and we'll make sure to reach out. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay. Thank you,
I wanna
everybody.
thank the team for putting up with such a scatterbrain, scattershot guest, but you've been terrific all the way.
Yes, thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Tomi, Healthy Seminars for hosting us. It's very much appreciated, and everybody for tuning in.